Prydwen just made the worst tier list for Wuthering Waves I've seen in the website's history. Those changes include putting Cartethyia right next to Carlaua in the same tier. And that comes off the back of them changing the way that the tier list works from previously being more DPS oriented into a metric they label as value. I actually personally make value-based tier lists, so why do I consider this a bad thing? There's three major metrics they've listed that I disagree with heavily in terms of their value assessment. One of the biggest examples of this, Cartethyia, is in T1. Now, I actually somewhat agree with the placement of Cartethyia being in T1, but when you look at the context of the characters that they put next to her and their own evaluation of how they label the tier list, it makes no sense. One of the biggest considerations for them in this tier list is the cost of a character, and Cartethyia is a character who pairs with Arrow Rover, for example. Cartethyia pairing with Arrow Rover in that regard drags down the total cost of her team, one of the metrics used for their calculation. Now, let's look at who's right next to her, Carlaua. Carlaua is a character who, for reference, does less damage than literally every single character in here, does less damage than every character in the tier below her, but somehow ends up right next to Cartethyia despite the fact that she needs more cost. In order to play Carlaua, you need high-cost teams. You're going to need either a Rhinne plus a Shorekeeper, you're going to need a Contarella, or you're going to need Jeje. So, not only did you just drag up the cost of a team, you dragged up the cost of a team to do less damage than what Cartethyia just did. So you're spending more for your resources, you're getting less out of it, you do less damage as a whole, and you have a lower ceiling. As someone who doesn't understand the game, which is who these tier lists are mainly aimed at, you're going to think that Carlaua and Cartethyia are near each other in terms of which one you should pull, but that is so far from reality. Carlaua is either pairing with complete garbage units down over here, or she's dragging down the performance of one of, if not the literal best character in the game, Rhinne. On top of that, you're doing way less damage for way more cost. There's so many examples of this throughout the tier list as well. Another character we have rated up here, Jinhsi. Jinhsi is a character who needs to pair with other 5-star limited units once again. With one of the most important metrics for their tier list being whether or not a character has value, how is Jinhsi, who's doing comparable damage to Chamellia, who uses more expensive teams than Chamellia because Chamellia can pair with Sanhua, going an entire tier above Chamellia into T2. But when you start breaking down other characters and what that value actually represents, it starts looking super weird too. Let's look at Jinhsi. Jinhsi is a character who comes up here because they're saying if you're playing non-quickswap Zani, it's a relatively similar performance, assuming Jinhsi's best team. Well, let's look at the context of that. Zani is only going for herself, her signature weapon, and Phoebe. Phoebe doesn't need the signature weapon, so that's a 3-cost team. You're pairing that with the Spectre Rover once again, right? Even if you're not quick swapping, that's still a 3-cost team that performs around similar to what Jinhsi would. Obviously, if you're quick swapping, they have the expert tag, should technically be higher, but we'll let that slide. Jinhsi over here is not performing anywhere near that in similar costs. Think about his team with Jinhsi plus signature, Mortefi, and Shorekeeper. That's another 3-cost team. So with cost being one of the most important metrics for their tier list, that Jinhsi team is performing nowhere near that level. Actually, it's going to be all the way down here below Chamellia. So why do we have Jinhsi in 1.5? Oh, it's because when we drag the cost higher, he can start performing a little bit better, on par with the team that we just mentioned with Zani. So it's important to remember that that's not factoring in the cost. So I'm not understanding what's going on here. On top of that, Jinhsi is now dragging down the value of both Chacona and Yuno over here. Chacona has better teams with Cartethyia, has a better team with Yuno, has a better team with Sigurka, and then Yuno has better teams with herself, Chacona, Rhinne. Yuno has better teams with Augusta, Yuno, and Rhinne or Shorekeeper, depending on what you want to run. Yuno can technically run with Sigurka if you want to play Sigurka, Choyuin, Yuno. There are a ton of options there. Both of these characters, which are the characters that drag up Jinhsi's performance, are performing much better without him. So he's actually dragging down the value of other characters on your account. How can this guy be T1.5 when he himself is not performing at those lower costs, which is the metric that we're using in this, right? But then simultaneously, he's also dragging down the viability of the other characters that he's pairing with who actually have T0 performances. He's dragging down the value of those characters. In what world is this a T1.5 unit? And I'm looking through this and I'm seeing so many inconsistencies labeled literally everywhere inside of the chart. Let's say Contarella, for example. Her direct opponent is Jeje. Think about what Jeje compare with. She compare with Jinhsi, she compare with Carlaua, and that's it. Neither of those teams are particularly good anymore. Just to give some context, her best performing teams, which are Carlaua and Jinhsi, are about the same performance as Luke free-to-play, a little bit under. And for reference, those Luke free-to-play teams are 50% worse than the highest performing teams in the game currently. We already have Jeje over here in T2, that's fine. But then Contarella, who can Contarella pair with? Furlova. Those Furlova teams are actually performing pretty well. They're performing much better than the Carlaua and Jinhsi teams, and then on top of that, she can also go with both Carlaua and Jinhsi. So how can these two be even in the same tier? You can even take Contarella and Furlova and put them in the same team as Sigurka. It's not amazing, especially since Sigurka has near best in the game performance currently, but it's still an option and it outperforms every Jesha team. Contarella actually has more options than Jesha. She outperforms her. How are these two in the same tier? And in what world are we going to pretend that Sanhua belongs on an account more then Contarella. That leads into the third problem I have with this tier list. When we look at the tier list, especially as someone who doesn't understand the game, especially as someone who is uninformed, we're going to see things like Verina over here, right next to Shorekeeper and Mornier, and we're going to think that having a Verina on our account means that we have Shorekeeper or Mornier on our account. That is just simply not the case. Now, obviously, Verina is put up here because she's a decent character and she lowers the cost of teams. She's essentially free because you can get her from a selector, or you can lose all your 50/50s like I do. But think about the context of a new person who doesn't understand meta looking at this tier list. They see Verina up here, they think it's right next to Shorekeeper Mornier, and you've essentially just misled them because of the placement of the character. Why are we considering that specific character's cost in terms of the value? Just because Verina is a free character doesn't mean we should be pairing it right next to Shorekeeper. It is completely nonsensical. But I look at this tier list as a new player, as a casual player, and I see Sanhua over here, and I think, wow, Sanhua is really better on account than Contarella is or Jesha is? She's not. We unironically have Donjin right next to Contarella and Jeja, like they shouldn't be down here. We unironically have Chun-Li below Donjin in a tier list. Like, that's the levels of cooked that we're talking about right now. This is a completely nonsensical tier list. I think we all need to understand this. When looking at this tier list, are we really thinking that all these characters right next to each other are really equal in terms of value? Are any of you right now watching this at home thinking that you would tell a new player to pull for a Cartethyia in the same tier as Carlotta? Are any of you guys watching this at home thinking that Mortefi should be right next to Yuno and Chacona in terms of value? Are we being serious about this right now? If you're looking at a tier list and you saw a tier list and you said Mortefi is over here not because he's actually good, but because he's a 4-star unit, does that not just seem misleading to you? Why am I even considering that when looking at the tier list? Yes, that can mean something for the other characters in terms of lowering their cost, but how does that mean anything for Mortefi specifically? That doesn't up Mortefi's performance. That doesn't make him actually good for an account. To make my point as clear as possible, I want the important takeaway to be this. Put yourself in the shoes of a new player or someone who's unaware of the meta. Look at this tier list. With the knowledge that you have now, with everything that I just told you, does this tier list make sense to you? Do you feel like you're giving an accurate image of what the game is like or what characters that you should be aiming for on an account when you look at this tier list? Then I want you to think about the metrics that they talk about in terms of cost, for example, and think, does this list really live up to that? Is Carlotta really a character worth thinking about in the year 2026 as a T1 unit when we're thinking cost? When she needs a 5-star sub DPS? When she needs a shorekeeper? When her teams are performing near 50% worse than the strongest teams in the game now? No. I think Prydwen's lost the sauce here. I think they'll update it. I think it'll become fine over time. But I think even with their stated metrics, once we understand it, especially what the tier list is made for, this is just not it. If you want to understand how to fix your cursed accounts, check out this cursed account review right here.